Look at any royal portrait. You see divine bloodlines, perfect genetics, rulers chosen by God himself. These people had everything, power, wealth, the best life could offer. But you're looking at a lie. The most powerful royal family in Europe didn't fall from grace. They destroyed themselves from the inside out. Their pure bloodline became so tainted that their last king couldn't close his mouth, chew food, or produce an heir. His own mother recoiled in horror when he was born. But before Charles II of Spain became a medical impossibility, before his protruding jaw made him drool constantly, before his body failed at every basic function, he was the heir to the greatest empire on earth. This is one of the few documented cases in history where we can see exactly what happens when humans push genetics past the breaking point. Modern scientists who analyzed his DNA found something that shouldn't be possible. He was more inbred than if his parents were siblings. What you're about to see is tragic and terrifying. It's the story of how the world's most powerful dynasty turned their own bodies into a biological nightmare. Let me take you back to November 6, 1661, to a dimly lit chamber in the Royal Palace of Madrid. The midwives have just delivered the heir to the Spanish throne, and something is terribly wrong. The baby's head is grotesquely large, his breathing labored. But here's what the history books don't tell you. Charles's own mother, Queen Mariana, reportedly shuddered when she saw him and refused to breastfeed her own son. This wasn't maternal cruelty, it was instinctive horror. You see, Queen Mariana wasn't just Charles's mother, she was also his cousin and aunt. How is that possible? Because his father, Philip IV, married his own niece. If you're trying to piece together this family tree in your head right now, don't bother. It's not a tree, it's a circle. But to understand how we got to this moment, to understand how a baby could be born so genetically compromised that his own mother recoiled, we need to go back even further. Way back when the Habsburg dynasty discovered the dark magic of keeping power in the family. Literally, the Habsburgs had a saying, "Let others wage war." You happy Austria marry. It sounds romantic until you realize they meant marry each other. For nearly 200 years, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg family had been marrying cousins, uncles to nieces, and in some cases double first cousins, tying the knot. They called it keeping the bloodline pure. Scientists now call it genetic suicide. Here's a number that will blow your mind: more than 80% of the Spanish Habsburgs' marriages were between close relatives. Not distant cousins you meet at a family reunion. We're talking about people who shared grandparents, or in some cases parents. When Charles II was born, all 8 of his great-grandparents descended from the same couple, Philip I and Joanna of Castile. All of them. Modern genetic analysis calculated Charles's inbreeding coefficient, the percentage of his genes that were identical copies from common ancestors, at 0.254. To put that in perspective, children of sibling incest have an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25. Charles II was more inbred than a child of siblings, but numbers don't capture the human cost. Let me paint a picture of what this meant for a living, breathing child. Baby Charles couldn't nurse properly. His mouth already showed signs of deformity. The bones of his skull hadn't fused correctly, leaving his head misshapen and swollen. Court physicians noted he had a weak suck and struggled to feed. In an era before formula, this was life-threatening. The wet nurses hired to feed him reported something disturbing. The baby rarely cried, not because he was content, but because he seemed to lack the energy. He lay there pale and still, his head too large, lolling to one side, his breathing shallow and raspy. The doctors, the best in Spain, were baffled. They had never seen a baby so fundamentally broken. As months turned into years, the true extent of Charles's condition began to reveal itself. And this is where the story gets truly disturbing. At 4 years old, Charles still couldn't walk. It wasn't that he didn't want to, he couldn't. His legs were thin as twigs, bowed by rickets, unable to support even his slight body weight. Servants carried him everywhere in specially designed chairs. The future king of Spain had to be carried like an infant. But wait, it gets worse. At 4 years old, Charles also couldn't speak. Not a single word. His tongue, already showing signs of abnormal growth, filled his mouth. His jaw, that infamous Habsburg jaw, was already protruding. When he finally spoke his first words sometime after his 4th birthday, they were slurred, wet, incomprehensible. Court chroniclers delicately noted that His Majesty's speech required interpretation. Let me spell out what they meant by that. Charles's tongue was so large it constantly spilled out of his mouth. His lower jaw jutted so severely that his lips couldn't close. This meant that when he tried to speak, saliva dribbled from his mouth. Royal attendants stood ready with silk claws to constantly wipe the drool from the chin of the boy who would be king. The Habsburg jaw. If you've never seen it, imagine a normal human skull. Now take the lower jaw and pull it forward several centimeters. Now imagine the upper jaw didn't grow to keep up. The result, a mouth that can never fully close, teeth that never meet a tongue with no proper place to rest. In portraits, artists tried to minimize it, painting Charles with his mouth slightly open as if mid-word. In reality, his mouth was always open because it physically couldn't close. Foreign ambassadors meeting the young prince for the first time often struggled to maintain composure. Private letters from a French diplomat describe the shock. The prince's appearance defies description. His jaw juts so far forward that he seems to have two faces, one stacked in front of the other. When he tries to eat, the food falls from his mouth. When he speaks, one must step back to avoid the spray. And eating. My God, eating. Charles couldn't chew. Think about that for a moment. Every meal, every day for his entire life. Charles II had to swallow food whole like a pelican. His upper and lower teeth were separated by a gap so wide they never met. Mealtimes at court became an exercise in creative cuisine. Meats had to be cut into tiny pieces. Vegetables were mashed. Bread was soaked in wine until it dissolved. The English ambassador, Alexander Stanhope, wrote one of the most visceral descriptions. His Catholic Majesty swallows everything he eats whole, for his lower jaw juts so far out that his two rows of teeth cannot meet. To compensate, he has a prodigious stomach and swallows an entire lamb in 2 meals. But the physical deformity was just the beginning. As Charles grew, or rather failed to grow properly, other problems emerged. He suffered from constant illnesses. Measles nearly killed him at 6 years old. Then came chickenpox, which left him covered in scars, followed by rubella and then smallpox. Every disease that swept through the palace found Charles an eager host. His compromised immune system offered little resistance. Smallpox was particularly cruel. It struck him at 9 years old, and for weeks he hovered between life and death. His face, already distorted, became a battlefield of pustules and sores. When he finally recovered, the scars joined the catalog of his disfigurements. But the disease left something more, a complication that would haunt him forever. Doctors noted fluid building up in his skull. His head, already oversized, began to swell even more. Today we call it hydrocephalus, water on the brain. In the 17th century, they called it another curse upon the prince. The pressure caused blinding headaches, vision problems, and possibly contributed to the seizures that would plague him in his later years. By 10 years old, Charles's education was a source of scandal in the palace. Not because he was rebellious or lazy, but because he simply couldn't learn. Tutors reported that lessons had to be repeated dozens of times. Basic arithmetic was beyond him. Latin, the language of royalty and diplomacy, might as well have been ancient Egyptian. His handwriting, on the rare occasions he attempted it, looked like the scribbles of a much younger child. Private notes from one tutor, uncovered centuries later, paint a heartbreaking picture. His Majesty tries with great effort, but he retains nothing. I explain a concept, and the next day, it's as if he never heard it. His attention wanders. Sometimes he stares into space for long periods. When asked what he's thinking, he cannot say. But here the story takes an even darker turn. As he entered puberty, or what should have been puberty, Charles's body betrayed him in new ways. He grew but barely. While other royal teenagers shot up in height, Charles remained stunted. His voice, instead of deepening, stayed high and thin. Body hair, almost none. The traits that marked a boy becoming a man simply didn't happen. Court physicians were consulted in secret conferences. They discussed what they observed but dared not record officially. The prince showed no interest in women, nor in men for that matter. He seemed to exist in a strange, childlike state, neither boy nor man, but something in between. This terrified the court because Charles had one duty above all others: to produce an heir. The entire Spanish Empire, stretching from Europe to the Americas to the Philippines, needed the royal bloodline to continue. But how could a man who couldn't grow a beard father children? At 18 years old, they decided to find out. Charles was married to Marie-Louise of Orléans, a 17-year-old French princess who by all accounts was beautiful, intelligent, and healthy. The contrast between bride and groom shocked the wedding guests. She was radiant. He was ghastly. She walked gracefully down the aisle. He shuffled, supported by attendants. When it came time for the kiss, observers noted that Marie-Louise had to visibly brace herself before leaning in. The wedding night was a disaster. Not the kind of disaster that makes for funny stories later, but the kind that determines the fate of empires. Charles, it became clear, was utterly incapable of consummating the marriage. Not reluctant, incapable. His body simply didn't function as a man's should. Marie-Louise, raised in the sophisticated French court, tried everything. She was patient. She was kind. According to palace gossip, she even tried instructing her husband in the basics of marital relations. Nothing worked. Years passed. No pregnancy. The queen underwent humiliating examinations to determine if she was the problem. Physicians declared her perfectly fertile. The problem everyone knew but no one said officially was the king. The pressure was crushing. Both Charles and Marie-Louise were subjected to increasingly desperate fertility treatments. She was forced to drink foul mixtures of herbs and animal organs. He was made to consume potions that included ground pearls and bull's blood. At one point, the court brought in a specialist who prescribed eating the dried penis of a stag. Nothing worked because nothing could work. Charles's reproductive system was as malformed as the rest of him. But wait, the story gets even stranger. Charles's mother, desperate for a grandson to continue the Habsburg line, consulted mystics and holy men. One suggested that Charles was cursed and that sleeping beside sacred relics might break the spell. When that failed, she escalated to something that still shocks historians. She had her son sleep beside corpses. Yes, you heard that right. The Queen Mother arranged for Charles to spend nights lying next to the exhumed bodies of saints and former kings, including his own father. The theory was that the sacred essence of the dead would somehow cure his impotence. Imagine the scene: the King of Spain, drooling and malformed, lying beside decaying corpses in the hope of gaining the ability to father a child. 10 years of marriage, 10 years of failed attempts, 10 years of humiliation. Then Marie-Louise died suddenly at 26 years old. The official cause was listed as appendicitis, but rumors swirled. Was she poisoned? Did the weight of her situation drive her to suicide? We'll never know. What we do know is that Charles was genuinely devastated. Despite everything, he had grown to love his wife, perhaps the only person who showed him true kindness. Within months, the pressure to remarry began. The council selected Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from a notoriously fertile family. Her parents had produced 17 children. Surely the advisors reasoned such robust genes could overcome even Charles's deficiencies. They were wrong. Maria Anna, despite her healthy lineage, never became pregnant. Not once. By this point, Charles's health had deteriorated even further. Courtiers whispered that he looked like an old man, though he was only 30 years old. His hair fell out in clumps. His teeth, the few that could be seen behind that protruding jaw, rotted and fell out. He shuffled when he walked, when he could walk at all. Seizures began in his 30s. Without warning, Charles would collapse, his body, convulsing foam mixing with the ever-present drool. When he recovered, he often didn't recognize the people around him. He began talking about seeing ghosts, hearing voices, feeling invisible hands touching him. The court was terrified. Was their king going mad on top of everything else? The nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched, took on new meaning. People genuinely believed Charles was under a curse. The Spanish Inquisition got involved. Exorcists were called in. At one point, the king's own confessor was arrested on charges of using witchcraft to worsen the royal condition. The trial was a sensation, though, of course, no exorcism could cure genetic damage. Charles himself believed he was cursed. In lucid moments, he would weep and ask what he had done to deserve such punishment. He wore amulets, carried sacred relics, and submitted to increasingly bizarre purification rituals. Nothing helped because nothing could help. His genetic code was his curse written into every cell of his body. By 35 years old, Charles looked ancient. Contemporary descriptions are hard to read. His skin hung loose on his skeletal frame. His famous jaw seemed even more pronounced as the rest of his face wasted away. He was completely bald, his scalp covered in sores. He could barely walk, shuffling a few steps before needing to rest. His speech, always difficult, became nearly impossible to understand. But the worst was still to come. In his final years, Charles began to deteriorate mentally at a rapid pace. He would sit for hours staring into space, drool pooling on his clothes. When spoken to, he often didn't respond. When he did speak, he rambled about demons and angels, about his dead wife, about children he would never have. The king of one of the world's greatest empires had become a hollow shell. The end came in 1700. Charles was 38 years old, not elderly by any standard, but his body was shutting down. He couldn't eat even his specially prepared mush. He couldn't stand without assistance. He spent his days propped up in bed, gasping for air, his hydrocephalic head causing unbearable pressure. On November 1st, after days of agony, Charles II died. What happened next would shock even the doctors who had treated him for years. The autopsy. My God, the autopsy. If you thought the living Charles was a medical horror show, his corpse was something out of a nightmare. The royal physicians tasked with embalming their king opened the body and recoiled. Their report, written in clinical Latin but dripping with barely concealed horror, described a body that shouldn't have been able to sustain life for as long as it did. His body contained not a single drop of blood. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. Charles's circulatory system had essentially shut down. His blood had either clotted or was simply absent. His heart, and this is where it gets truly grotesque. His heart was described as the size of a peppercorn, not literally that Hawkins, but shriveled, blackened, barely recognizable, as the organ meant to pump life through the body. His lungs were corroded, their word for what we would now recognize as massive scarring from repeated infections. Imagine lung tissue that looked more like pumice stone than organs meant for breathing. His intestines were described as rotten and gangrenous. Parts of his digestive system had literally died while he was still alive, explaining the horrific pain he endured in his final years. But the most telling detail, the one that confirmed what everyone suspected but no one dared say officially, Charles had only one testicle, and it was black as coal. That single atrophied, dead piece of tissue was all that remained of what should have been a functioning reproductive system. No wonder he couldn't father children. It's a miracle he survived puberty, and his brain remembered that oversized, fluid-filled head. The doctors found it was indeed full of water. Hydrocephalus had left little room for actual brain tissue. How Charles could function at all, how he could speak and think and rule, however poorly, was a medical mystery. The doctors who performed that autopsy must have stood there covered in the gore of their dissection and marveled that this collection of malformed organs somehow sustained life for nearly 4 decades. Every system was compromised. Every organ was damaged. It was as if Charles's body had been at war with itself from the moment of conception. Modern genetic analysis has given us the why behind this horror show. Remember that inbreeding coefficient of 0.254. That means 1/4 of Charles's genome consisted of identical copies of genes. In those repeated sequences were the instructions for his destruction. Scientists now believe Charles suffered from at least 2 severe genetic disorders. The first was combined pituitary hormone deficiency. His body couldn't produce the hormones needed for normal growth and development. This explained his short stature, his inability to mature sexually, his muscle weakness, his cognitive issues. His pituitary gland, the master controller of the endocrine system, was essentially non-functional. The second was likely distal renal tubular acidosis. His kidneys couldn't properly regulate blood chemistry. This caused the rickets that bowed his legs, the muscle weakness that left him unable to walk, and possibly contributed to the hydrocephalus that swelled his skull. Either condition alone would be challenging. Together, they created a cascade of failures throughout his body. Add the Habsburg jaw, genetic condition called mandibular prognathism, and you had a perfect storm of genetic disasters. Some researchers have proposed an even rarer possibility, a lysosomal storage disease called aspartyl glucosamminuria. Patients with this condition develop normally in their early years, then begin to show delays. By adulthood, they have coarse facial features, intellectual disability, and reduced life expectancy. The match to Charles's symptoms is eerily precise. But here's the truly horrific part. Charles wasn't exceptionally unlucky. He was the inevitable result of systematic inbreeding. Of the 34 children born to Spanish Habsburg monarchs, more than half died before age 10. The dynasty was literally breeding itself out of existence, and Charles was simply the final, most extreme example. When Charles died without an heir, it triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that would reshape Europe. The Spanish Empire, built over centuries, shattered because one man's body was so broken it couldn't produce a single child. The Habsburg line that ruled Spain for nearly 200 years didn't end with a murder or a revolution, but with a king so inbred that his own flesh betrayed him. The Bourbon dynasty that replaced the Habsburgs learned the lesson. While royal marriages remained political, the extreme inbreeding that created Charles II was never repeated. The nightmare of the Habsburg jaw, the horror of Charles's autopsy, the tragedy of a king who couldn't chew his own food, these became cautionary tales whispered in royal courts across Europe. Charles II remains in medical textbooks as the ultimate example of genetic collapse. Genetics students see his portrait and learn about inbreeding coefficients. His Habsburg jaw became a byword for the dangers of closed gene pools. In a strange way, his suffering contributed to our understanding of heredity and the importance of genetic diversity. But beyond the medical curiosity, beyond the political consequences, there was a human being. Charles II lived every day in a body that was failing him. He endured constant pain, humiliation, and the knowledge that he was failing his most basic duty as a king. He was mocked as the bewitched when his only curse was his ancestry. In his final letter dictated because he could no longer hold a pen, Charles wrote about hoping to find in death the peace that eluded him in life. For a man who endured 4 decades of physical and mental anguish, who was propped up on the throne as a grotesque puppet, death must have seemed a mercy. The portrait I mentioned at the start now hangs in the Prado Museum in Madrid. Visitors stand before it struck by the obvious deformities even a court painter couldn't fully hide. But now you know the truth behind that image. You know about the jaw that wouldn't close the tongue, that wouldn't fit the body, that didn't work the genome, that turned on itself. Charles II of Spain wasn't cursed by witches or demons. He was cursed by his own family tree, a tree so tangled it became a noose. His story stands as perhaps history's clearest warning about the dangers of genetic isolation. By trying to keep power in the family, the Habsburgs destroyed their own lineage. The next time you see a royal portrait, remember Charles II. Remember that behind the crown's scepters and royal grandeur, biology always has the final word. And sometimes that final word is horrific beyond imagination. If this story shocked you, hit the like button, because the algorithm, unlike royal bloodlines, rewards spreading the wealth. Leave a comment with your thoughts on which hidden historical figure story you'd like me to uncover next. Subscribe for more suppressed historical truths your textbooks definitely didn't cover. And remember, every time you promote genetic diversity somewhere, a Habsburg ghost breathes a sigh of relief.